the introduction. I have prepared a presentation and will share my screen with you. But first of all, can you hear me all?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. And can you see my presentation?
Yes, very clearly. But if you want to make it on full size, yeah.
Yeah. So
Great.
now I will see just a few of you on my right side.
Yes.
So I was asked to give a talk on methodological and theoretical reflections on the issue of ecological sustainability from a Muslim perspective. And of course, this is a very wide field, and my lecture will just give a glimpse on this field. Research on ecological sustainability in general and among Muslims can be very manifold. So what I'm going to do in my talk today, I want to focus on Muslim environmentalism as an object of study, and I want to argue for research designs through which practices of environmentalism can be grasped in a concrete and detailed way in order to find out what Muslims actually do and say when it comes to environmental practices. I'm intending to highlight some key points for consideration when conducting a research, but these considerations are also true for every kind of social research. I will not go deeper into conceptualizing, planning, and executing empirical research projects, but I want to point out to the importance of formulating research questions carefully, as well as to the importance of recruiting interlocutors, the occurrence in the field, the pitfalls of conducting interviews, analyzing and writing up data. We will talk about which questions can or should be posed, which aspects should be highlighted, and how an appropriate research can be conducted. So this chart points out to various aspects when researching Muslim environmentalism. The arrangement of the topics in the chart should not be seen in a hierarchical order, but as intertwined. But of course, when we have a look into the research literature, we will be aware that some areas of focus are more studied than other areas. On the left side, you find normative elements and sayings. They are derived from Quran, which is the verbal revelation of God put together in the book Quran. They are derived also from Hadith, which contains all sayings and doings of the last Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Also, these normative elements and sayings are derived from fiqh, which is the Islamic law system, and also integrating all aspects of worship. And also these normative elements and sayings based on kalam or derived from Quran. Kalam is the philosophy of religion from a Muslim perspective. Or more or less, it's a discipline of philosophy of religion from a Muslim perspective. The circle of normative elements and sayings is deeply interwoven with the circle on top, the ideas, and I can state that scholarly approaches to Muslim environmentalism privilege mostly normative elements and sayings, as well as theological reasoning, which base on relative scripture and ethical positions. And when I say ideas, I mean key values, rights, and of course ethics, all of them developed in a worldwide discourse on environmentalism, like protection of the creation.
I can't hear.
Is there a problem? No? Okay.
Sorry, I think only we have someone. Patricia is trying to get the sound, and I think she pressed
okay.
Without taking care of it. Yeah, sorry for that.
No problem. I have to rearrange my screen. I'm sorry.
No worries. Sure.
So yeah, you can see the chart.
Yes, it's still visible.
Yes, the ideas on the top of the chart, they are developed in a worldwide discourse on environmentalism, like protection of the creation, like valuing the nature, like governing the earth in the best way, like human responsibility for other humans and non-human creatures, and like the preservation of natural resources, and so on. These ideas originate from a perspective of an environmental crisis in modern times, and the approach of Muslim intellectuals to the environmental question was and is highly informed by the notion of the ambivalences of modernity on one hand, and of critique of a Judeo-Christian anthropology of submission of non-human creatures on the other hand. Therefore, the development of a theology of environment or eco-theology within Muslim theologies can be read as a distinct answer to the environmental crisis through Muslim lenses with self-critical re-readings of the religious texts in order to develop a relational and holistic anthropology. A hegemonic way to derive Muslim positions to environmentalism is by privileging the textual approach with its hermeneutic methods and ideas-driven exegesis. Applied to the Quran and to the Hadith, a large spectrum of ethical positions in Quran and Hadith can be theologically extracted. Prophetic doings and sayings, according to modern environmental positions, serve hereby as models for Muslims. For example, the practice of land protection in order to preserve land for animals and plants, called hima, in the times of the Prophet Muhammad, has been developed as an exemplary prophetic practice of environmentalism and wider ideas according to nature protection areas based on this updating of a prophetic practice. When scientists of religion begin to investigate a special issue, is usually theologians and other scientists begin with principles of religion, according to the boundaries of this religion, and therefore they reproduce these principles. And mostly theologians are interested in the scripture and to derive some insights from the canonical texts. In the Islamic case, of course, this is the revelation of God to Muhammad, compiled in the book, the Quran, but also other texts can be canonical. This is, of course, a very useful start in order to find glimpses of environmental ideas in the relation between God and the human, and of course, to use historical evidences for considerations of actual problems. Now, when we turn onto issues of ecological sustainability, systematical consideration, like the works of theologians and intellectuals, are crucial. They are grounding a certain Islamic perspective, bringing forward discursive knowledge, and have the potential to be translated into practice by pedagogies and politics. But yet, religion is not just about the revelation, the scripture, and ideas. Back to the chart on the screen. On the right side, you see the circle media. Right after studies on normative elements and ideas, the analyses of media make up the second most investigation. Analyses of media outcome, that means texts and video and audio material and also objects, are in the core of media analysis. Books, treatises, sermons, textbooks, digital data, speeches of politicians, intellectuals and scholars, and several other textual data serve as material for investigation, how environmentalism is made up mentally and ideologically. Also, analyses of actions of institutions that make up the circle below, public institutions as well as those founded through actors of civil society networks, and in this context also religious communities, provide insights into positions and social practices of environmentalism. I think we had a glimpse on such an institutional practice this morning by Sheikh Khalond. Despite the necessity of scholarly works on exegesis, on ideas, ethical values, media outcomes, or institutional politics, however, to some extent, this has led to a marginalization of empirical studies on how environmentalism is actually lived by people. In order to understand why people are devoted to any religious feeling or to religiously driven actions, we have to investigate much more than the mental perspective. We have to turn to practices and we have to use various tools of empirical social research. But when we turn to empirical studies, however, we see that the textual perspective is still hegemonic. Empirical studies on environmentalism among Muslims tend to query positions and attitudes of Muslims at least in Europe and in North Africa, in order to compare them with the ethical and theological positions of the ideas. In short, these studies ask whether Muslims are aware of theological debates and exegetical outcomes, how Muslims base their positions on environmentalism, on Islamic or Islamized ideas, and they ask how successful a certain Islamic environmental perspective becomes among Muslims. These empirical studies work with questionnaires and surveys, and in case of qualitative social research, they work with interviews mostly. For example, many scholars look on practices of pedagogies. Therefore, they ask how ideas derived from systematical considerations from the Quran and so on are put in educational politics, in textbooks, in didactics, in sermons, and so on. From ethnographic studies on education, we know that teaching experiences do change the ideas they foster and promote during the particular process of coming into life. But interestingly, studies on environmentalism in education do not take into account such insights from other educational issues. In contrary, they analyze usually the positions of teachers via interviews, or they analyze only textbooks or teaching goals in the syllabus. They replace one text by another text. So we have to put aside that knowledge is stable and static, and to consider that especially religious knowledge is extremely built up in social settings. How people give meaning to certain religious ideas depends on how they encounter these ideas. But today I don't want to speak a lot on ideas, but on how the study of practices can bring forward a certain perspective also for the development of ideas. So let's start with the pillars of empirical research. First of all, quantitative research. The data of quantitative studies based on surveys. Usually they work with the thesis and people have to fill out a questionnaire. Normally, quantitative research should base on results of qualitative research, but the contrary has been done. Scholars develop theses on the basis of general ideas of environmentalism, or they query theological ideas, beliefs, and attitudes, no matter whether they are suitable or not. Qualitative research, on the contrary, should be explorative, investigate case studies, and formulate a typology. Interviews constitute the main method within qualitative research. They can be unstructured or structured or semi-structured, and normally scholars use thematical analysis for coding. But my long-standing experiences with quantitative and qualitative empirical social research with and on Muslims show that neither method is fully suitable when we really want to look into the schemes of what people actually do and how they give sense and meaning to their actions. When it comes to environmentalism, the situation is much more unsatisfactory. So I think there are pitfalls of interviews, and they are worth to mention. Interviews only provide a snapshot of social life, whereas other methods such as observation may better capture everyday life. Also, interviews represent motives, positions, and reflections on certain issues. So interviews may be ineffective if people are unaware of behaving in the way they do. Empirical research should be driven by theoretical reflections. That means by reflection on theoretical presuppositions and a disclosure of the theoretical base. Why am I asking the questions I ask? Which assumptions do I have? Which categories do I use and why? Such questions should be our motto. And therefore, I prefer the anthropological approach. The anthropological approach combines textual and empirical data and analysis. And what is anthropological approach about? I highly recommend an anthropological approach when planning and conducting an empirical research. It contains of a sampling contains a sampling of methods to gather data. Participant observation is the method most applied. It means that the scholar investigates his or her field of study by not only observation of the field, but by participating and observing. Besides texts like literature, verbal data like interviews and conversations with and among interlocutors, a concrete description of the social setting is crucial for the ethnographer. When it comes to actual practices, my preferred means in participant observation is the observation of actions, of what people actually do. I mean, people can fill out in a questionnaire or say in interviews that they are aware of the protection of the nature and that they feel responsible for the creation because, for example, they love God. And therefore, for example, they sort their rubbish. But when you observe the same people while acting, you can see if and how they actually sort their rubbish or they do not, besides their ideas according they take care for the nature. This information is, at least for me, much more interesting than the verbal expression and positioning towards environmentalism. So in my view, an anthropological approach helps a lot when it comes to theoretical reasoning on empirical findings. I always have to reflect, or I'm trying to reflect, my notions and codes, my assumptions, my associations with the actions I observe, and I try to replace them by others. And then I ask myself, does anything change? And what happens then? So when we come to practice, there is an ambivalent notion of that. The understanding of practice in newer theological writings, at least in German and in the Turkish context, we have a lack of critical references to practices. Praxis is just seen just as the application of norms or the non-application of norms. But in my view, practice is a field of challenges with a need for theological reasoning and founding. And I'm sure that observation of doings and other practice-relevant objects can help us to bring forward theological reasoning. So practices, in my view, are considered as comprehensive and socially shared practices. They are not isolated and not just individual. So even a practice or an action of an individual is socially shared because it's a part of the wider knowledge. And practices should not be considered as the outcome of normative knowledge. So in empirical studies or in the outcomes, in the results, we often can read something like Muslims are doing that and this is because of the second pillar of Islam, or this is because in the Quran in Surah 5 verse 6 God says something and Muslims act like they have read the book. So practices, in my view, contains routines and rituals, of course, not only religious rituals, but rituals in the acting. And of course, we have the emotions, the feelings. The people have a knowledge of appropriate and also of inappropriate forms of acting, for example, of clothing and of communality. And all of this is held together by implicit methodological and interpretive knowledge. And also we have to distinguish between intentional practices and not yet reflected practices, especially when it comes to environmentalism, when people have a certain mind on environmental issues, then often we can see intentional practices. So when my kid is sorting the rubbish, for example, or to stay with this example, he knows that we are doing that, but it's a socially shared practice. Everyone is doing that. And so we have learned this behavior, and we are doing that. And yet it is intentional on one side, and on the other side, we don't reflect it anymore when we are actually doing something. So what do we have to consider when conducting an empirical research on environmentalism among Muslims? So we have to put the people, and in the specific terminologies, bodies, as agents or actors in the focus of our research. And we have to consider field-specific structures. This is the state, these are institutions, and these are laws and other things, rules. And in my case, I look at activities, and these are bodily movings, gestures, emotions, speaking languages, and of course, body politics concerning clothing, eating, nutrition, and other bodily things. When we talk about practice and the bodies, we have to consider habits, and of course, the issue of embodiment and how embodiment works. And from research so far, we know that embodiment takes place along with experiences, understandings of certain ideas, and of course, by taking a stand, by positions. And we have to consider the social, the cultural, and of course, the economic positions and resources. In the morning, we have heard that farming is not possible when the land is not in the hand of the people. So what is the economic position which is the motor for a stance towards environmentalism? Also, we have to consider materials and abstract objects in the specific field. And like in every research, always we have to consider the setting. This means the time when we do our research, the space, where do we our research, and of course the social settings. That means the neighborhoods, the families, the community institutions, the institutions of the religious communities, not only the mosque, but other facilities. We have to consider the structure of the town and the region. Where do the people live and how do they live? This approach let me think of quotidian and non-quotidian life as driven by routines, rituals, and emotions, also with harmonized behavior patterns with the knowledge of appropriate forms of acting in general, but also and also other things. So when we do access practices, then we have to consider all these aspects more or less. And always not just observing and describing the people and the actions we see and we observe, but also the structural phenomena which determine the position of the people in society or in a special social field. Yeah, like economic field, like the religious field, like the field of politics. When we talk about practices, we need to take into account that embodiments can be observed as a result, and maybe when we are lucky, we can observe the processes of embodiment. Then we have activities, movings, speakings, doings, and sayings. The last slide was about what we have to consider when we conduct the research, but also when it comes to the analysis. But concerning the analytical frames, there are other points too. With the description and analysis, the practical meaning of a certain practice can be derived, and we get access to the processes of production of a certain discursive and practical knowledge, of its negotiation, circulation, authorization, dissemination, modification, elimination, preservation, and selections. So notions of new versus old knowledge come into light. Or we can investigate the conditions, the forms and implications of certain discursive and practical knowledge. This vantage point permits scholars to investigate questions about ways of life, about forms of religiosity, community, the role of values, and the ways of solving problems, and so on. So we can say that enacted in a practice are discursive, material, and symbolic chains of processes and politics. And this is the last point. Often norms and practices are seen as opposites, or the practice is assumed as more real than the norm, which represents somehow an ideal. But norms are not just distant ideals without connections to practices. The contrary is true. Normative concepts are embodied through socialization and experiences within the people. Even such things like questioning a norm, adaptation of a norm, the integration of norms into social life or on the individual life, and also the rejection of normative concepts tell us that norms are important. Therefore, norms and practices should be viewed as intertwined. And we can say that practices and norms represent the two sides of a coin. Against this background, the last question one should raise in a study on environmentalism is whether norms guide the practice and whether the practices guide the norm. Research on practices with this perspective can contribute, in my view, to a deeper understanding of religion and religiosity, of normativity and performances, especially when it comes to questions on environmentalism. Thank you very much, and I hope it was helpful, my humble reflections on methods and theories of research on environmentalism among Muslims.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akca. It was a very rich presentation, and I'm surely helpful. If you want, we can stop the screen sharing now, and I would like to ask you, would you like to take question already now, or do you want to go deeper into the text that they should have read for today? Yeah, please let me know how you want to proceed.
Maybe we can do a question and answer session.
Yes, sure.
And then I would take questions from the students or from the participants on the text. It was just for preparation for those who are not familiar with the topic of Muslim environmentalism, and the chapter I gave you somehow integrates various considerations, and especially the idea how to do analysis of environmentalism and which biases are driving us.
Okay, and then we will start the Q&A. I will start with Tanya because she wrote me already in the chat that she had a question. So we will start with Tanya, please, and yeah, continue then with the people raising their hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Doctor, for your interesting presentation. I can't sit in all the sessions, but I'm very happy that I was able to sit into this one. I'm a lecturer from UP, and I work a lot on ecofeminism. But lately, in the beginning of this year, I've been a lot concerned about the whole understanding of knowledge and, you know, this type of perspective about what is epistemology and all of that. So my question to you is, you speak a lot about norms and how norms relate to practice. Can you maybe give one or two examples of norms that would influence practice? Because you speak a lot about it, but I would be interested to hear if you can give an example of the type of norms that would influence what you have described. So it's, for me, that's just an interesting question. Thank you so much once again.
Yeah, Thank you very much for the question. Yes, this is an important topic. How are norms guiding practices and vice versa? I want to give an example from my field research, but it's not on environmentalism, it's on gender issues. There is the norm of separation, of gender separation in religious communities within a mosque, for example. So we have a male masjid, which is the main masjid, and a women's section. And usually the people are okay with that they get separated when entering the mosque or when entering the mosque court. And sometimes these norms are questioned, not verbally, but by doings. In one case, there was a festival, a religious ceremony was going on, and children of the congregation were in the main masjid, delivering some prayers and songs and so on. And the mothers of them, they were in the women's section without any free sight to the ceremony going on. They were behind the curtain. But then some women opened this curtain in the beginning, just a little bit, just to have a look on their children. But then after 10 minutes, 15 minutes, the whole curtain was away, and all of these women could have a look, and also the male congregation could see the women too. But also there were some women who were not confident with the situation. They were against the opening of the curtain, and they tried to hide themselves behind chairs and desks and something else. And it was very, I observed them, and they were very upset about this, that their norm-guided appearance in this mosque, in their women's section, was questioned, and that other women, without asking them, opened the curtain and the whole the masjid for them. So the norm is gender separation, and in this case we have to practice that this gender separation was questioned, and not only questioned but deleted. And afterwards, there was a dispute, a very tangible debate was going on among the women. The male congregation was not part of this debate. It was just among the women. And in the moment when women can refer to the Quran or to the Hadith and say, gender separation is not a practice from Prophet times, but a newer one, and it's a sign of patriarchal society, the congregation was convinced that they are doing something non-Islamic. But in the moment when the women don't refer to canonical text, but to social arguments like, or it's very thick here in the women's section, we have no space, or we want to see our children, or we are together, men and women, outside of the mosque, so why should we do so within the mosque rooms? This was not long-lasting and long-standing. It was just for the moment, but without the norm, the practice couldn't be get familiar in the practices of the other people. And this was the situation when I thought about, on one side, we have the norm, the ideal, and on the other side, we have the practices. And it's not that the practices are not connected to the norm. And on the other side, the norms also, they, when people talk about these norms, they always have the practice in mind. They say you have to act like this and that, and so on. Could I answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much. It's very interesting, and I'll like to engage with you separately on that specific example. I find it very interesting, so thank you so much. Thanks, Nora.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. We will go to Emmanuel, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. There is this notion among Christian scholars when you are doing eco-theology, some of these Christian scholars think that eco-theologians read meanings into text. They read meanings into biblical texts. I want to find out if you had similar experience or challenge when you were doing your research among the Muslims.
Yes, thank you. So you are asking whether the practice of Christian scholars to read meanings or derive special modern meanings from the Bible. And as if among Muslims, I can observe similar attitudes. Okay, yes, of course. This is a very modern topic, and I would say all religions are familiar with that. For example, there is no such thing like environmentalism in the Quran or in the Hadith. But of course, we have things like protection of the earth or responsibility for humans and non-human creatures. Or tasarruf is the Arabic word for, I'm sorry, I have to find the English word for it. Sorry, I have to look for it.
Is it like doing something, the action, tasarruf?
Saving water, for example, being against wasting resources. This is a very high topic in the Quran, of course, and in the Hadith too. In the lecture this morning, we heard a lot of water savings and like that. This water topic is a very big topic in the Hadith and Quran, but of course it's not connected to somehow environmentalism. So modern concepts of society can be found in the canonical texts. So, and one of the critiques of traditional scholars is that Muslims, as well as theologians, Muslim theologians, read meanings which are not in the text. But other theologians are aware of that theology is a living culture, and that we can't be like 1,000 years ago, and that we have to put the revelation of God into actual terms and periods, and to derive meanings from it. This is what theologians actually do. And of course, sometimes it's like or I think, yes, yeah, the imagination of the theologian here is very huge, and maybe God is not saying anything on a current issue in this special sentence or surah, but people are reading it like that.
Thank you very much. I will go over to Juliana, please.
Yes, thank you so much for this super interesting lecture. I would like to concentrate more on the part of researching that you described and research methods, maybe, because I was wondering about the whole topic of knowledge production that we are basically doing or contributing to as researchers. We are producing knowledge about religions, for example, eco-theologies in different religions. But I'm wondering about the relationship between the researched and the researchers and their roles in knowledge production, in academic knowledge production, because I'm still just struggling to really grasp this relationship between who is producing which part of the knowledge that is afterwards considered knowledge about and eco-theology, for example. Yes, and I was wondering about your experiences in this relationship in your research.
Yes, thank you. This question should be driving all of us when conducting a research, not only empirical research, but every research. And in the chapter I gave you to read in preparation for this session, this issue is highly raised. It's about our own knowledge, our own setting, and how do we read terms and concepts and notions, and which assumptions do we have. And I've made the observation that when I am in a room with 3 other persons and we observe an ongoing action and we talk about this later, all of us, we have different views and we observe different things and we describe different things. And so when someone is doing anthropological research, we always have to talk about what we observe, what we describe, what we understand, and how do we understand these observations, the meanings the people ascribe to their actions, to their practices, and so on. So on one hand, we have the issue of positionality. What is my position, and from which position do I do my research, and how is this contributing to a knowledge which is already, for example, biased. And on the other side, we have to look for other interpretations and other assumptions. And of course, when it comes to Muslims, for example, or for formerly colonized regions, we always have the problem that the knowledge production is highly a Western issue. And even when I, as a Muslim in Germany, am doing research, I am part of this knowledge production system. And always I have to question my own assumptions and what do I see when I see things. I made the experience that talking about observations, about interpretations, about analysis, about my results when it comes to knowledge and knowledge production, even with my interlocutors. In the end of my research, I always present, and I have done this, my results or a part of my results to my interlocutors, not just to take their ijaza, their okay for my research, but also for discussing my views, my interpretations, my notions with theirs. And it was very fruitful, and I can recommend this practice highly.
Thank you very much. I see many more hands up. We will go to Deirdre. Deirdre, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Nora. Thank you very much, Dr. Aisha. Yes, I just have a question in terms of, you mentioned embodiment and you mentioned practice, and also within the sphere of empirical work, interviews and so forth. And in embodiment, and I know this is not a conversation that has really been started yet, but perhaps it's something that's being taken into consideration. We also talked then about verbal and non-verbal body language within embodiment and so forth, which obviously plays a very crucial role when one do interviews, empirical work, or within the social aspect of practices. So has this, and I want to also dichotomize just for clarity, when one has a unified agenda, there is embodiment of verbal cues that is driven by a separate spirit, then the unified, then always in that cases, it really moving to different directions as where it moves into unified direction. So if I wanted to dichotomize what I'm saying with the missionaries and the idea of spreading Christianity for the purpose of development, but then the spirit that was driven the purpose of development, the good idea really was to oppress and to subdue. So in that case, if we look at a unified agenda of development within our post-colonial settings, and we take embodiment, and embodiment, of course, we can't just use verbal language, we can't just only speak about body language, but we also should speak about the spirit behind the body language. In terms of epistemologies, this is something new, groundbreaking for South Africa, or Africa as a continent. So my question is, has this been taken into consideration within empirical work? And if it does, or if not, is it something that one could maybe focus more globally going forward? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm not sure whether I have understood the last your question and the last point you made. Is it possible for you to repeat your question? I'm sorry, there was
Yes.
a connection problem too, and I'm not sure.
Sure. So yeah, I've given a context because I needed to make sure that it's properly understood. So I'll just summarize it now. In terms of our ideologies, right? So when one do an interviews, an embodiment also consists of verbal and non-verbal language. So with our own positionality that you mentioned positionality, of course, comes from ideologies, right? And within our languages, what we speak a unified language and a unified agenda, right? But within our body language, that could speak a different agenda driven by a different spirit. And when one do interviews, that obviously impacts on what the result is going to be in terms for analysis. Is this something for the global scale? This is groundbreaking for South Africa and in our epistemologies, separate from the West. Is there something from on a global scale that globally will be a focus going forward? Because when one do an analysis of an interview, it can completely, the wrong information can be taken if the verbal language and that spirit that drives the verbal language is not taken into consideration. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. I have to think about this. This is a very important question and a very important issue when conducting a research, especially when it comes to interviews. And this is why I have a certain critique on interviews, because the scholars, they focus on the verbal expressions and normally not to the gesture or on bodily postures or something like that. It's we are so driven by the idea of language, of speaking, and speaking languages is like thinking. So this Western idea of the connection between language and reason is so profound in our thinking and conducting researches, that I think we have to question this, but we can't do it. We can't get outside of our own training. In the chapter I gave you to read, there is something like there is something going in this direction you are asking. It's about what do we see when we do field work somewhere, no matter if interviews or other things. And the author is saying that in many cases, for example, a certain Orientalist approach is driving us. And so we just see things, we think these are important, and other things we don't see. In the case of this book, it is like the Sufi milieu, the Sufi setting, is seen as a non-normative environment, a social setting. Sufis in the Orientalist tradition, at least since Ernest Gellner, for example, are not representing the true Islam. They are something like demotic practices or deviant practices doing communities. But Anegade is saying that we have to take into account all people in a distinct region who are important in any way. They are not a minority group, or even when they would be a minority group, it would be very important to do researches in these regions among these people. And Anegada is saying that the Orientalist view on environmental issues is looking on nature, on creation, and of responsibility of humans, but for example, not on devotional practices or on readings and sayings and chantings of prayers and for example, chantings in religious ceremonies and so on. And these practices are crucial for the process of embodiment of certain norms or ideas. And in the way the people do practice these devotions and elaborate their, or not elaborate, but cultivate their religious feelings in these fields, they can contribute to a wider understanding of what environmentalism is about. I mean, I think we have to do a lot of research and a lot of work to question our biases and to come with a fresh perspective on these issues. And my stance is that research on Muslim environmentalism is a lot of on this normative aspects. What is the Quran actually saying, and like that, and not what are the people actually doing. And so there is a lack of this connection between the practices and the ideas. But this is a pitfall of modernity. We all look at reason and cognitive knowledge and on knowledge production in this rational sense, and other things like devotions, like bodies, is not at the core. I'm not sure whether I could really answer your question. Maybe it's because I haven't done much field work outside of Europe, just Turkey. But Turkey also is part of the Western world and a part of the post-colonial world too. So maybe when we are doing research as a Westerner somewhere else, the problem could be otherwise, or should be otherwise.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Janine, I saw your question in the chat, but we will take it after Philip's question. So for now, it's Xolile, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akca. And again, also to my colleague, Deidre, I think you are grappling with the issue that I too am grappling with, Doctor. In your intro, you mentioned the fact that there's a reaction which led Muslim environmentalism, if you like, to critique the Judeo-Christian kind of approach or theology, which really leads to subjugation and domination of nature by human beings. But as you were dealing with that, as they were reacting to that, the literature that you have referred us to, I picked up the idea also of within Muslims now of dichotomization between the humans and the non-human kind of living beings, which inevitably takes us back to the same square one, because the minute you make that separation, inevitably, you raise and elevate the role of man over nature. And so I was reading with curiosity now to see in terms of the Sufi, in Sufism as well as what is proposed by Gade in terms of an Oriental kind of approach, that are we beginning to observe, as people that are doing research, a bridge where we kill the dichotomization and we look at nature as one, so that there is no room for exploitation and subjugation, but that we come in to protect what is there and to treat it as one of us instead of us and that other part of creation. So that's the issue that I was also kind of grappling with. I had hoped that Sufism was actually going to assist in that. It looks into the doctrines, it looks into the social, the political, and all of that, but couldn't help but to see the gap where it failed to actually bring in nature. And then in reality and in practice, we still see, in terms of the normatives, continuing where man continues to run down creation, as it were. So it was just a reflection on my part, Doctor. But I think Deidre also was grappling around the same issue. I don't know whether if you want to give a comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. It's I think it's very crucial to have this in mind. Always this notion of environmentalism as a crisis of the Judeo-Christian anthropology of subjugation of non-human creatures under the human guiding. This is something which we can see in the Christian theologies too, when it comes to issues of environmentalism, and it's not out of a sudden that Muslim theologians, especially doing their writings and thinkings in the West, like Nasser Hussain in the United States in the 1960s, or others, that they position their writings and their considerations within these structures of thinking on environment and environmentalism. I think it's and also on the other side there is also a tension of apologetics or of polemics. Not we as Muslims are responsible for the destruction of the world, but it's the Christians. This is somehow a very rigid reading of the colonial world and the capitalist world and the modernity, the age of modernity. But this is somehow often Muslims do, that we are not responsible for the situation now, but we can do something to come out of the situation. I always thought that this comment or this view does not bring us forward. The issue is not who has the guilt. This is not the question anymore, at least. But of course, we have to take into account that which parts of the world have benefited from the situation so far, and who are not the victims, but who are affected, very much and very badly from the situation. So when Muslim theologians think on environmentalism or more widely the connection between the relation between God, the human, and the nature or the creation, we can see many associations coming from a spiritual care for the world. And of course we see Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and other religious ideas working in this system of environmentalism. And on the other side, when we look at the practices, we can see, or we can distinguish between various ideas and various forms of knowledge. And by seeing them, maybe we can bring forward other aspects of what we can do in order to protect our world and to take responsibility for our world. I think this is a very very big issue of epistemology, how we conduct researches on this issue. Yeah, but thank you very much for your comment. It's very crucial.
Thank you very much. Patricia, I saw you. I will take your question afterwards. Now it's Jan Philip's turn, please.
Yes, thank you for your informative presentation, rich in information. I would like to come back to a point that you mentioned when you spoke about normative elements and practices. And I think if I understood you well, you said that these two points are not opposite one to another, but they are entangled, or let's say normative elements are embodied into the practices. And me as a theologian, Christian theologian, I was directly thinking about normative elements having some kind of universalist dimension or validity. So I think in theology, at least in Christian theology, normative elements have always a universalist dimension. They are valid for everyone, or they seem to be valid to everyone. And I would like to know, what is your opinion about that? Is it just something like a construction of some people who want to have power and or they want their ideas to be powerful? Or is there something like universalist dimension of these normative elements?
Yeah, thank you very much. You point out to various issues, the universalistic and the visions of theologies. In my view, at least the Muslim theology, but I think the Christian theologies too, they have a vision like all of the people, all of the men on earth can benefit from the revelation of God, and that God is or was telling for the group in Mecca and later in Medina 1,400 years ago, a guidance. This notion of guidance, that the Quran is something like a guidance, a hidayah, is a very modern one. Saying that doesn't mean that the Quran was not important in former times, but we see the shift of the focus from the philosophy of religion, which can be universalistic, to the exegesis of Quran in the last 300 years in the age of modernity, of course, and we see the influence of Protestant scripturalism in this case also. So when Muslim theologians formulate ideas derived from Quran or religious ideas at all, they always have this vision of universal ideas, that all people can benefit from that. And also there are other theologians who are looking at the settings, at the distinct settings, and say not every idea is applicable everywhere. At least not, for example, in secular societies or in minority contexts, or maybe it should not be like that. So the idea of universalism versus what would be the other term for that, regionalism or something like that. I think in the Muslim theologies, at least in Europe, we see a shift from the thinking that there is one universal Muslim theology, beliefs, and so on, but that these beliefs that one must put them in the context of course, there are things like Tawhid, the belief in one God, and this is not questionable. This is the very core of the Muslim belief and the Muslim theology, which would question at this point would not be a Muslim theology anymore. But other things are not quite clear. Last week, I attended a conference, and it was about what is the Quran actually saying, and about the Ayat al-Ahkam. These are the verses which refer to some law issues. And one of the theologians attending conference said that these verses, Ayat al-Ahkam, should be understood as a philosophy of law, and or how people can generate fairness and justice to the people and so on, no matter whether they are women or children or men or rich or poor. And the colleague said this is the very core moment of the Quran and of the tafsir, of the exegesis, that we have, that we must consider the setting, the social, the time, the space, and so on, when we formulate theologies, especially when it comes to topics like environmentalism. I think this is crucial. It's very important. Was this an answer to your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I will go to a question that Janine posted in the chat and then ask Patricia to ask her question afterwards. So Janine wrote, Dr. Aishe, was ethnography part of your research? If so, how did it contribute to knowledge production, as it is a trending way of conducting research?
Yes, autoethnography. Normally I should ask, what do you mean by this term?
Janine, this question goes to you. We can't hear you. Janine, unfortunately, we can't hear you. Yes.
It is about your personal story, your narrative. It's storytelling. So why I've posed the question is, for academic writing, right, there's a certain criteria. And to deposit knowledge, you need to conform your research in alliance to the criteria. I'm just thinking, why I'm posing the question is, I want to introduce it into my own research, and I'm sort of a bit skeptical, because I feel it makes you as the author or as the researcher a bit biased. And now my argument is, how will the reader or the scholar community receive my research?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, your question points out to at least two aspects. One is, when I have conducted my research, I conducted as an ethnography. After long years of doing interviews and quantitative research, I wanted to do an ethnography. And I have chosen the town in which I lived at that time. And this was a very good decision, because through this way I could get in contact with the people I'm talking to, and I'm observing their doings in the mosque associations. Even when I'm going on walk or shopping, or when I'm at the kindergarten with my children, and then I see a mother whom I know from the mosque, and so a very familiar situation occurred. And some scholars say you have to be aware of a distance and don't get native and something like that. But in my case, it was very important to get native. First of all, because of Muslims are under observation of the state in terms of counterterrorism, and in terms of integration politics, and in terms of being part of the German nation, and so on. So as a researcher or as a scholar in this field, it's always hard to get access, and it's hard to get the trust of the people. I mean, an anthropology means that one is invited to be part of the families, the neighborhoods, the doings. Sometimes this could be very intimate, and I don't want any researcher in my home too. But when I trust this person and I know her or him, then I'm willing to invite the people in my home and to let them be part of a ceremony or of my lunch or whatever. So in this case, in my fieldwork, it was very important to be part of the communities. And often the people, haven't seen me as a researcher, but as a member of the community, as a Muslim, as a Muslim daughter for the elder ones, or as a sister for others. And yes, this opened doors for me. And a friend of mine who is a white non-Muslim researcher, she had the problem that she couldn't get access to the people's homes and their thinkings. It was just in the German language, a little bit Turkish, but there was no intimate connection to the people she was doing research on. And I think this was the problem, that in the case of a non-Muslim researcher not speaking the language or the common language or the common languages, it was hard, or it is hard for a researcher to really get the points the people are doing there. And at least in the German context, this is the situation. And in my case, I had the impression that my Muslimness opened the doors for being a part of the community. And of course, I always had to be aware of a distance, and to reflect on my doings and my my bodily gestures. How do I encourage my interlocutor to say something in a direction? One case I can tell you, it disturbs. It has disturbed me very, very much. I was asked from the women's group in a mosque association to be part of the committee for the March 8th, the World Women's Day. And the mosque association wanted to do some activities on this day. And they asked me, because of my language skills, because I knew many people in the town and in other women's groups, whether I want to be part of it or not. And first of all, I said, no, I'm just an observer, a researcher, but this was not the point for them. They have heard it, but they said, okay, then you can be part of us. And we are doing something on Muslim women, on Khadija, on Aisha, on Fatima, on Maryam. And then I asked, and what about modern women? not just the women from the times of the Quran or from the prophetic times, but modern women. Yeah, there are several. And then they asked me who, for example, and I said a name. For example, I said a name. And 1 or 2 weeks later, I encountered that one of the women prepared a presentation on the woman I proposed to her. And afterwards, I thought, I am the one who brought forward a topic, and it was not the natural situation in the mosque. They had done, they would have done presentations on Maryam, on Khadija, and on Aisha, but not on the modern women from the present. And it was my fault that I proposed it to them. And also, I mean, every Muslim has the problem nowadays to not to be a terrorist, but to be, yeah, you have to say what you think on Palestine and on anti-Jewish sentiments and so on. And in this case, this special woman was criticized for being part of a political Islam. And afterwards, I thought, when the national police, Verfassungsschutz, the security services will be aware of this mosque association because of the Women's Day and the presentation of a woman who is part of the political Islam, then it was my fault because I proposed that. And this, of course, is a problem when you are doing research. You are part of the community, and this is very good because you can get access to everything. But on the other hand, the people want something from you. Yeah, they want to benefit also from your experience and your knowledge and your position. And nowadays, I wouldn't propose any name. I would be very careful. But this was 6-7 years ago during my fieldwork, and I was not aware of this problem. So everyone should be always aware of their own position and what are you saying, not only in terms of which questions do I ask and which terms do I use, but also how do I act in these situations. Yeah. Yeah, is this an answer to your question? Was it okay?
Partially, but it was enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Patricia wanted to say something. You have to, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Doc, for the very uplifting presentation. I missed the whole 15 minutes since I didn't have a sound. But whatever I got in the middle, it is good enough. It's not a question. I'm a student, so questions is what we do with our immediate supervisors. But right now, it's a comment, which that's when I had a sound. I was able to walk with you. I do like when doing research, anybody who's doing research, which we all do, especially as students, and then when it comes to methodology, you really have to go deep and think that, okay, how do I impact knowledge to the masses that are going to read my work? Because when you're doing research, you are not doing it for keeping it. You want it to be out there and be heard and shared. And how do I add value to my community? So we always look at which way that will really resonate with my work. So when you spoke about the anthropological approach, I was really, really excited about it, because in African theology, what we do as African theologians, we really emphasize, especially in my case, on the anthropological approach. Because if you study, especially I prefer to use cultural anthropological reports, Because if you study the cultural practice of people, the people that you are going to work with, that your research is targeted to, and those that are beyond your research, you are not going to be able to get any results when you come with your questionnaires from Norway, because we have been identified with the people. And as an African Christian, we identify with Christianity, the teachings from biblical teachings. We identify with God, and the fact that Jesus came to identify with us, because no one would have known who is this Jesus for that matter, because we haven't seen him. We just heard spiritually, but when he did the ultimate sacrifice of identifying with us as Christians through the cross, and that was the beginning of saying, okay, there is somebody who's speaking the same language as we do. There is somebody who is trying to address our iniquities. This is somebody who's putting their life in order so that we can be saved. And the whole thing, I won't bore you because I'm not a practical preacher. I'm a systematic theologian. I go into the knowledge part of the thinking more than the preaching part. And just as well, if I was in the preaching part, I don't think I would have much of an audience, because people want to know about miracles, and I don't believe in that, because the fact that you are here, all of us, it's a miracle because we are all breathing. So when it comes to the anthropology, especially the cultural anthropology, it allows you not only to identify with the people, you know who they are, you know their educational background, you know their different belief systems, you know what they like and what they like, you know their suffering because you are part of it. It is through identification that you are able to extract information that is relevant to the people, because there's only one person who can tell their story, and it is the primal source, the one who has lived it, who has experienced it. Because I work with the indigenous knowledge people and indigenes across board, and their life words is who they are. It's a true representative of their belief system. So when doing research and then you are approaching them in that identification method where you are part of them, it is very likely, not just likely, but it is the truest, in the truest sense, you are getting the knowledge of how these people are living. And for my research question, this is what I would like to build into this community. And you find that through identification, especially human beings, we are not created in a different way. We are created as one embodiment, of which we are, our connectedness with the natural world, it comes systematically, because we are not apart from creation. This is why when it comes to ecology, you find that people, especially in African religion, we don't need somebody to stand there and say, okay, this is the earth, you should look after it. It is part and parcel of the well-being of the people. It is who we are. The identification with me and land is inseparable. It is intertwined. It is the interconnectedness that forms an African communalism. But a researcher coming from the Western point of view is going to come waving the paper. He wants the questionnaire. What you need. It's not about what do I need. It's about me telling you what I need. And that's it. Then it works in it. And then when it comes to the norms, you also spoke of the normative behavior. The norms, it is so true, because it is through our normative formation that our behavioral patterns and whatever we do is part of the norm. So especially in an African culture, there is no way that Christian anthropocentrism can be a cause of our ecology in our understanding, because already the fact that we are aware of our ecological status in the world, it is because of creation, and we know that as people, we are the custodians of the earth. So it is the must, it is the only command that we have to look after the land. And when we're looking after creation, we don't mean only part of the land. We mean that every other life form, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter the characteristics, but it is creation, and all life forms, they hold an intrinsic value that we as humanity As much as we are perpetrators and victims, we are doing we are doing it wrongly, because our standing in this society, in this world as we breathe, is to look after the land and look after creation, which means I can look after you, I can look after everybody else. It doesn't matter where you come from. But when it comes to the West, then it's a different notion, because they are coming with a different aspect altogether. Whereas once you study anthropocentrism and you know the background of the culture of the people, because there is no Christianity without culture. You cannot be a theologian if you are going to be preaching and saying the culture is wrong for the people, because there's nothing. It is culture that builds the people. That is their belief system. And for you to come with any idea or any educational background and to teach people the way of life which they already have, you cannot teach them the way of life. You can enhance because of the education that you are bringing, but on their terms. That's all. It's not a question. But thank you for that approach. I really like it.
Thank you very much for your comment. It was like a very good ending word, I would say. This is very important for me that other researchers appreciate my approach, and in no matter I want, it's just an encouraging those who are doing research on certain aspects. But this is more true for the European context than for a South African or for an African context. I'm not aware of. I have to say I'm not so much aware of, and my context is the European and the North African, Middle Eastern theologies and fields. And it was a pleasure for me to talk to you today and to hear your comments and the questions. Thank you very much.